Watching Nigeria from the UK where you live and work, now you're here. Give us a sense of what you've seen and feel on the ground in terms of the oil and gas sector, specifically the petroleum industry.
Well, I mean, I think obviously the first thing that everybody's watching is the governance issue, and the governance issue falls into so many categories. One is actually sort of the restructuring of the national oil company, which I think a lot of people are, feel quite frustrated that Nigeria has sort of allowed the NNPC to operate quite opaquely over the last decades of its existence. And I think that the key signal that people will be watching is whether or not the new government is going to take a decision to actually restructure, and what exactly that restructuring looks like. I mean, are we looking at the potential merging of several units within NNPC? Are we looking at the potential taking away of the regulatory rule authority of the NNPC? I think that's what a lot of my own clients are watching, first of all. Secondly, it's actually the way that Nigeria structures its oil contracts. I mean, I think one of the things that obviously a lot of people are quite concerned about, and I think unfortunately hurts Nigeria, is the way that Nigeria effectively has middlemen actually getting oil onto the markets. In a time where you've got an oil glut and actually a drop in oil prices, I think competition is no longer about the attractiveness of your crude grade, which Nigeria obviously has got fantastic light sweet crude, but I think also the security of supply and the ability to actually get that supply onto the market quite quickly means that Nigeria can become a bit more competitive. But with Nigeria effectively operating contracts with middlemen, it becomes much more difficult and actually makes Nigerian crude far more expensive. So I think on those two fronts, the governance issue in terms of the operation of the NNPC and the way that Nigeria structures its oil contracts, I think those are the two things that people will be looking for.
I'm going to ask you this directly, Cheto. Talking about restructuring the existing national oil company, the NNPC, what would you suggest? Would you suggest that Nigeria has a new national oil company, or a new reformed national oil company, or runs a petroleum company on behalf of the country that is commercial in nature, perhaps the way of Malaysia, perhaps the way of Brazil?
I mean, I think I look at it in two ways. The first being that, if we're looking at, I think that Nigeria does need a new national oil company, and this is just my own personal opinion. But I mean, this is actually a medium-term project. We're talking about, having an act of parliament, first of all, to take off the NNPC Act, to repeal the NNPC Act, and to actually pass another law for a new national oil company. Obviously, we know that with Nigeria's parliament, expeditious passage of bills have not exactly been forthcoming. So I think what we probably need is restructuring of the current NNPC as it is, with the long-term view of potentially sort of closing down and starting a new national oil company. So, and I think Nigeria can do that on two fronts. Like I said, the most important thing that people will be looking for is signals at this point. And unfortunately, the fact that we don't even have a cabinet, we don't have a petroleum minister, means that those signals are not even are not there at the moment. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think what the new Buhari government has to do is effectively sort of give people a blueprint, a roadmap of where things are going to go with timescales, so that people are able to hold the government to account on those timescales and on what it should look like. But to answer your question directly, I definitely think that Nigeria needs a new national oil company. I recognize that it's a longer-term project, and therefore the reform of the existing NNPC at the moment is the first place to start.
Okay, thank you, Cheto. Let's bring in Dolapo here. Dolapo, from what we've seen so far in the last 24 hours, the president just sacked the boards of all parastatals departments and agencies, as it were. Taken from Cheto, says this is a long-term thing. Do you see what President Buhari is currently doing as part of laying the building blocks, as it were, the foundation for a more sustainable economy that will, whether we like it or not, still significantly oil-based?
Yeah, you see,
because we can run away from that in the short to medium term.
Yeah, I would like to pick on something she said. It's important to generate the right signals. And that's what I feel we need to really give right now. Because, see, Nigeria has two problems. For me, it's number one, it's a structural problem. The fact that we are very oil dependent. That's a structural issue, which affects pretty much everything else. Because that's how the dollars come in, that's how the government's revenue comes in, and pretty much affects the rest of the economy. The second problem is a perception problem. Right now, investors believe several things about Nigeria. Some believe, number one, that he's not going to really make a lot of differences. Some people believe that we need to devalue the naira. Some people believe, so there's a perception issue. And that to correct that, we need to first of all start giving signals about how we want to address the structural issues. Now, so yes, he has taken some steps. He has dissolved the board. That board was already dissolved the moment the minister changed, handed over. So it really wasn't a functional board. They probably met maybe like 3-4 times in the year, this year alone. So it wasn't really an action like what we want to see. What we're expecting to see is how he reconstitutes these boards, how he brings in technocrats, how he brings in perhaps like the model they have in Norway, where you have top officials from some of the leading oil companies in the country as part of the board of the state-owned oil company. There are various models to swing this. What you also mentioned is also key. It might be a need for us to strip the regulatory functions of NNPC and house it in a different body and run NNPC purely as a commercial company that actually publishes its accounts and everybody can see it. Or if we're going to keep it the way it is, then NNPC has to push down all its production activities, operating activities, crude oil activities down to MPDC, and MPDC runs as a commercial company, but NNPC stays as a regulator and owns NPDC, the commercial arm. There has to be a way to make it work, but we have to start at NNPC. That's really where the changes have to happen.
Okay. Cheto, let's get back to you. Talking about the downstream part of the business. Cheto Manji, thank you for still being there. Looking at subsidy issues, the president has said he's not going to do that, remove subsidies, at least for now. There's no timeline to whether he will do it, or perhaps he would reason over time and says, I'm going to keep it for some, whatever reasons, political, economic, social, whatever. Give us your take on that.
Well, I mean, I am very sympathetic, I think, to the domestic view on subsidies. At the end of the day, we're looking at inflation trending upwards. I think that every sort of economist in the country probably agrees that we are at a real risk of inflation hitting about 10%. When that happens, I think is still up for debate. And obviously, lifting those subsidies would obviously push quite a number of prices up. We're talking food prices, transportation costs. So, you know, I am quite sympathetic to that. But I think, as you say, the damaging thing here, and I come back to the issue of signals, the damaging thing here is to leave an open-ended period on when those subsidies will be lifted. Because let's face it, as Dolapo said, Nigeria is hugely dependent on oil from a revenue perspective. That's where all the dollars come. It's quite obvious with the oil price drop, and potentially, you know, another, like I said, the uncertainty as well with oil prices means that it becomes completely unsustainable. Let's face it, the subsidies have actually been quite unsustainable. It still remains unsustainable for Nigeria to continue to fund those subsidies. So to leave an open-ended period as to when those subsidies will be lifted, I think is quite damaging for the country, because it means that the naira will continue to take a beating as investors actually start speculating on the currency. And, you know, from my perspective, so while I think the subsidies have to go, I'm sympathetic to the fact that the president has decided to not lift those subsidies. I think it would be important, however, for us to get a little bit more clarity on how he expects to put those subsidies. And to be clear, I think that, you know, lifting subsidies in Nigeria is probably going to be a task next to impossible to completely lift subsidies. But there are other ways and other countries that have demonstrated how you can have effective subsidies. You can make direct cash payments to lower class families that actually can benefit directly from going to the pump to actually pay for their fuel. At the moment, what we've got is a rent-seeking system where it doesn't matter what the subsidy price is. Nobody's actually at the pump paying the price of subsidies, which obviously tells you that there's a lot of leakages in the system. So this system that we've got at the moment is absolutely unsustainable. And like I said, the government needs to give a signal as to when those subsidies will be lifted.
Cheto, I'm going to cut in here. Now we got a twin problem here. At the upstream sector, Nigeria needs significant investment in crude oil production. We need to get a lot of local guys in the business. The banks have been playing their part. You have that on one hand, with the problem with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others on the oil. At the downstream sector, we're holding a multi-billion-dollar annual subsidy for consumption locally. How long do you think the Nigerian government can juggle these two balls at the same time and have a kind of a safe landing?
I personally think that, you know, by September, unfortunately, I think all the forces will come to bear on Nigeria. You know, in terms of the government's fiscal situation, I think at that point, the government will have to make a decision whether or not it's going to have to go to the international capital markets to borrow. And if it borrows, I mean, I think the markets will punish Nigeria if it's not clear what a lot of that borrowing will be going into. And that's the reason why I make the point again about, you know, sending the clear signals on timing as to when those subsidies will be lifted. There's no way the markets will sort of not punish Nigeria if Nigeria decides to go onto the bond market, and then it's using some of those funds to actually finance things like the subsidies. And obviously, I think the Naira sort of speculation and the Naira depreciation, that's not going to go away. I mean, I happen to fall into the school of thought that a potential devaluation by Q4 of this year is still in the works, until we get a little bit more clarity on what happens with the fiscal situation. So from my perspective, I think we're looking at Q4 as when things actually come to a head, and the government will have to make a decision and actually give clearer signals with clearer timeframes.
Okay, thank you, Cheto. Dolapo, we're rounding off in about 60 seconds. Now, this is a story, this is a conversation that's trending significantly now on social media. So we got one of our viewers here talking about how investors are beginning to take a second look. Moses said investors are beginning to take a second look at their exposures to Nigeria. In about 30 seconds, talk us through what Cheto finished off there, that Nigeria has to take a decision by September. We need to do something.
Yeah, we do. Because, again, we looked at the Yellen interviews with the House recently. And
the semi-annual briefing.
Yeah, the semi-annual briefing. And she indicated that, yes, she actually wants to raise rates. Now, she wants to do it gradually and so on. And we expect, and most analysts believe that that will happen in September. It will have significant impact because the dollar is already strong. And it will only strengthen it further and attract a lot of funds away from Nigeria.
So the question is, are we keeping an eye on the United States interest rate decision as we discuss oil here? Thank you very much, Dolapo Oni, the head of energy research at EcoBank Development Corporation. And live to us from Abuja, thank you very much. Also, Cheto Manji, who is the CEO at, it's our vice president, I beg your pardon, the vice president at Ateneo Intelligence in the UK. We hope you enjoy your time in Nigeria. Thank you for your intervention today.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Hope to see you in the future.